Hello, and a very warm welcome to this, yet another of our fantastic offering, or we hope our fantastic offering at the Lockdown LitFest. As ever, we hope you're well, we hope you're keeping safe, and we hope you're being careful, and with any luck, enjoying some of this glorious weather. Today, I'm absolutely delighted to be able to introduce, unashamedly, I will say, a very dear and much revered friend of mine, Ben Crystal. Ben's an actor, an author, a producer, and an explorer of the original practices in Shakespeare rehearsal and production. Curator of the Shakespeare Ensemble in their 2019 tour of Japan, they raised 3 plays in 7 days, and using modern reworking of Elizabethan rehearsal practices, they reimagined the pieces with every pass and welcomed resonances from modern kabuki practices. He was the co-writer of Shakespeare's Words and the Shakespeare Miscellany with his father, Professor David Crystal, to give him his full title. And his first solo book, Shakespeare on Toast, Getting a Taste for the Bard, was shortlisted for the 2010 Educational Writer of the Year Award. Would you please give a very warm welcome to Ben Crystal? Ben, now listen, we're trying to be in the same studio, but I'm in my granny's flat in my parents' house in rural Warwickshire. Whereabouts are you, sir?
I'm in Holyhead in North Wales, in my parents' house, in my dad's study, actually.
How very lovely! Yes, I can see behind the very elegant algorithms that have placed us in the same room that you're in a room lined with books. I would expect.
I'm surrounded by books in this house. It's been a wonderful upbringing.
I'd expect no less. So we're here today to celebrate the 452nd anniversary of the birth of Shakespeare.
Oh, goodness. Well, so you're making me do maths, aren't you? 1564, so 458? We're going to, no,
6.
4 minus 6. How dare you make me do math?
No, you see, I've completely mucked it up myself. I think we're celebrating the 456th anniversary of the birth of Shakespeare. And as we got there eventually. As you're one of the greatest living exponents, along with your father, of Shakespeare in original pronunciation, how would you like to celebrate this auspicious day?
Well, we're doing a bunch of different things. I'm doing some online videos to help the homeschoolers. Dad and I have a new iteration of shakespeareswords.com coming out, and that's free for homeschoolers and teachers as well at the moment. But right this very moment, how about a sonnet? Yes,
please. Would you mind?
I'd love to. So this is Sonnet 113. Since I left you, mine eye is in my mind, and that which governs me to go about doth part his function, and is partly blind. Seems seeing, but effectually is out, for it no form delivers to the heart of bird, of floor, or shape which it doth latch. Of his quick objects hath the mind no part, nor his own vision holds what it doth catch. For if it see the roots, or gentlest sight, the most sweet favour, or deformedst crater, the mountain, or the sea, the day, or night, the crow, or dove, it shapes them to your fater. Incapable of more, replete with you, my most true mind thus maketh mine untrue.
Beautiful. Ladies and gentlemen, Ben Crystal reading one of Shakespeare's sonnets. Which sonnet number was that, Ben?
That was 113. Since I left you, mine eye is in my mind.
In original pronunciation. Ben, thank you so much. That's very generous of you, and we'll have another couple of sonnets throughout the course of this conversation.
Gladly.
The thing I want to talk to you about is, can you define for us, please, what you understand by original pronunciation, how you and your father have come to the conclusions that you've come to, because it fascinates me. And to be perfectly honest, I'm a complete duffer and know nothing about it.
Well, if you were to take the Shakespeare's Globe Theatre on the south bank of the River Thames in London, the modern reconstruction, and you were to hit it with a tuning fork, it would make a sound. That tuning fork would strike a note as similar, as close as we could possibly get to the architectural and aesthetic dynamic that they had 400 years ago, with a few modern differences. Fire sprinklers on the thatch, as we learned some lessons. and concrete cement on the floor instead of mud and piss and shit and hay, because, you know, that's not necessarily what people want nowadays. But it's pretty close. It's as close as we can possibly get. And I suppose they would call that an original practice building, a building that is most similar to the practices of 400 years ago. And in that building, they've explored costume, original practice costume, how that changes the way you move when you're doing Shakespeare, and original practice song and fight and everything else. And in 2004, they invited Dad to come in and work out whether they could do an original practice sound, I suppose. Most people, myself included, grew up thinking that Shakespeare was supposed to be spoken in received pronunciation, an accent that has only really been around since the late 1800s. Yeah. So what would Shakespeare sound like? And fingers crossed, please, will it not sound like my high school teacher trying very badly to do Chaucer in sixth form, you know, because that just felt so difficult to understand, so far from us. And if there's a problem perhaps with hearing Shakespeare in RP in received pronunciation, it's perhaps that it does distance people from Shakespeare, because after all, received pronunciation is only spoken by 2% of the population of Britain anyway. Yeah. So what original pronunciation is, it's a sound system, it's a collection of sounds, and everyone who comes to it will have their own version of those sounds. So the thing I like very much about it, and the reason why I've started to explore it, is because anyone coming to Shakespeare will no longer have to remove their sounds, their own personal vocal fingerprint that they've spent their life honing, and replace them with the sounds that Shakespeare should sound like. Instead, they will be able to marry their natural sounds with these sounds from 400 years ago and make a sound that is very much theirs, is very much individual, is very much unique, but also will beautifully resonate with the sounds of the rest of their company, which is essentially what happened 400 years ago. Now, we know, well, we can get about 80 to 90% right, and we get there with, well, with the sonnets. 2/3 of the 154 sonnets don't rhyme in received pronunciation, and you know, every sonnet, or nearly every sonnet, ends in a rhyming couplet, and certainly has an alternating rhyme sequence. So it would be nice if they rhymed, and if they don't, then there's two conclusions. Either Shakespeare wasn't a very good poet, possible, or the sound has changed. And if you go through all of the sonnets and you go through all the rhyming plays like Richard II and Midsummer Night's Dream, you get a good chunk of data that tells you, for example, if this be error and upon me proved, I never writ nor no man ever loved. Well, it had to have been either proved and loved or looved and proved. And going around all the other plays and poems, you can work it out, and it was proved and loved. They used to spell a lot more like they used to speak. So going back to the first edition of Shakespeare, like the first folio, you can see words like film spelled P-H-I-L-O-M-E, which is a 2-syllable pronunciation, or maybe a 3, film or filame. And in Ireland and in India, still the film is still pronounced film. That's an Elizabethan pronunciation that stayed with us. And there were orthoepists at the time, early linguists. Ben Jonson, the dramatist, wrote a grammar, and at the beginning of his grammar, he has a guide to pronunciation. And as you well know, history is written by the history makers, so maybe he chose sounds that he liked and ignored sounds that he didn't like. But still, all of those sources get us to about 90% right. And then, as I say, the last 10% you fill in with your natural sound, as Shakespeare's actors coming from all over the UK to London would have done back then.
That's extraordinary and beautifully explained. I really now get a grasp on it. Although I have to say I'm hitherto unaware of the Elizabethan cinematography school that allows there to be a film. I know, very bad joke. Who started? Was it your dad that started this? When did interest? Has there been? Was there any interest in original pronunciation of Shakespeare in the 19th century, for example, or is this very much a modern 20th century and 21st century academic endeavour?
I don't know of any 19th century, Dad might, but certainly Daniel Jones, the linguist in the 20s and 30s, and then Peter Hall, the great founder of the RSC, who passed so recently, and John Barton too, also we lost relatively recently. Great Shakespeare experts and directors. They apparently did original pronunciation as a sort of party trick, like something they just break out every now and again. And both were, or in fact, all of those reaches towards it were pretty close, but nothing really seriously happened until, well, I say 2004, 2005, those explorations by the Globe were sort of toe dips in the pool. Then they invited me and the ensemble I was curating at the time back into the Globe in 2014 to 16 to explore the sound in the San Wanamaker Playhouse. In the interim, lots of different countries have taken it and run with it, especially in America. I suppose partly because the Americans have spent so much time thinking that they're not doing Shakespeare right because they don't have RP. They don't actually speak received pronunciation. And I think one of the great things about original pronunciation is the ownership that it gives, that it levels the playing field, that it basically says, if you want to speak Shakespeare, then you can. Your voice is the right voice for it. And of course, with American, they're doing a lot of the sounds already. You might have heard in that sonnet earlier, and you'll hear again shortly. It's got a quite hard rhotic R sound, and generally, a lot of Americans already do that sort of R sound. There have been other explorations around and about. Funnily enough, well, maybe not so funnily enough, the interest in the UK has been a little more moderate, I suppose, because so much of the Shakespeare-going, theatre-going generation expects still to see and hear Shakespeare and receive pronunciation. It wasn't that long ago that criticism was being laid at Barry Rutter's Northern Broadsides Shakespeare Company because how dare they speak Shakespeare in their northern natural accents.
Yeah, exactly. I knew you're a great Shakespeare communicator, and I'll prove it. There was an event that you did at a literary festival, I think it was Cheltenham, when we first met each other, when you were on stage in front of 300, should we say, less than engaged teenagers. And I saw you take to the stage, and I thought, I was busy, I was chairing other events. I thought, I'll just watch this guy for 10 minutes. An hour later, I was still there and entranced to see how you'd taken 300 disengaged teenagers who were sort of leaning back in their seats, arms crossed with that sort of, okay, go on, entertain me type pose. And watching them lean forward, nudge their mates, you know, put their elbows on the chair in front and really engage with you. I'm leading up to a question, which is this. What does OP do for Shakespeare for audiences? What does it convey that non-OP Shakespeare misses?
Yeah, that's lovely. And, you know, the greatest success of that time was not just being able to engage with those 300. The slightly bigger success that trumped it was that I kept you in the room. I can joke too. No, it was such it's always such a lovely thing to be able to create that light bulb moment. Yeah. And I think OP does that too, because it, you know, there isn't a future, I don't think, if we go from saying, I mean, who should say that a particular form of art has to be associated with a particular sound? That's ridiculous.
Right.
And to go from, oh, Shakespeare only should be done in received pronunciation to, oh, Shakespeare should only be done in original pronunciation, well, that's just out of the frying pan into the fire. But perhaps original pronunciation can be a bridge. Right. From this place of Shakespeare should sound like this to a place of, well, as I said earlier, Shakespeare can sound like anything you like because you want to speak it. And I think for an audience coming to it, well, I mean, especially when we're touring to particular small communities or what have you, I might lessen the size of the font of original pronunciation. You know, there are enough barriers and obstacles around Shakespeare, and people's ideas of what original pronunciation might be can sometimes push them away. What happens generally, though, is after that first moment of retuning, of sort of tuning into that tuning fork, the response across the board is, it's the clearest Shakespeare I've ever heard. Yeah. And I think it's because rather than listening to a sound that is generally associated with them, with the elite, with a cultural high that people don't feel like they have access to because they didn't have the right education, or they haven't had the right training or background or whatever, or they're just not skilled enough. They're hearing a sound that, depending on who you say it to, they will say, oh, that sounds a little bit like where I come from. It's kind of like the great grandmother of all of the English accents that we're speaking now. So there aren't many people who speak English who don't hear it and tune into the vowel qualities that are theirs. So now you've got a situation where you've got a group of actors who haven't been told they have to remove their own sound, all sounding similar but still sounding individual. Yeah. And you've got an audience that are engaging with them. Add to that, like the shared daylight situation of the globe, so they can actually make eye contact with the actors and feel like they're being talked to and feel like they're going on a journey with the protagonist. Listening to a sound that is so accessible to them, listening to a sound that actually means something to them, listening to a sound that's familiar, yeah. Then a bit of this relaxes and a bit of this opens up. And I think the same thing happens with the actors. A lot of people say that the experience is more emotionally engaging than they're used to with Shakespeare. I think it helps that OP is generally spoken a bit faster, that it's not declaimed like poetry that might break if we speak it too roughly. And because as you well know from all of your time chatting with poets, people think that poetry makes more sense if you slow down, whereas actually, if you allow yourself to get caught up by the ride of it, then it will take you to somewhere you never thought you could go.
That's a very good point. If you hunt around this site, the www.lockdownlitfestsite.com litfest site, you will see Afra Atik, who speaks at about 10 words a second, a fantastic Emirati word artist, and is perhaps the best example of exactly what Ben has just been describing. Ben, would you do us the honor of declaiming your second sonnet, please?
Oh, sure, yeah, absolutely. So the first one, since I left you, mine eye is in my mind, being without someone that you might care about. This next one, I suppose, is a little about solitude too, or at least about the thoughts that might occur to you. Sonnet 29. When in disgrace with fortune and men's eyes, I all alone bewail my outcast state, and trouble deaf heaven with my bootless cries, and look upon myself and curse my fate, wishing me like to un more rich in hope, fated like him with friends possessed, to desire in this man's art and that man's scope, with what I most enjoy contented lest. Yet in these thoughts myself almost despising, haply I think on thee, and then my state, like to the lark at break of day arising from sullen earth, sings hymns at heaven's gate. For thy sweet love remembered such wealth brings, that then I scorn to change my state with kings.
Just wonderful. God, I could listen to that all day. What number was that?
That was 29. When in disgrace with fortune and men's eyes.
Thank you very much, Ben. Thank you.
Beautiful sonnet.
Yeah, it is a beautiful sonnet.
And you know, I think not to divert too much, but there's so much in Shakespeare's sonnets. I relatively recently started dipping into the Tao Te Ching whenever I wanted to, and it can be quite an overwhelming book. I think Shakespeare can be quite overwhelming too. There's 154 sonnets. Where on earth do you start? And to dip in and find one that resonates with you today, wherever that may be, yeah. Being alone and thinking things can't get any worse, and then you think of someone or something that suddenly lights the fire of your spirit again. He's always got something, some little piece of advice that will help you through, I find anyway.
Absolutely. Ben, listen, can we talk about your writing? We've talked a lot about Shakespeare's writing and how you understand it and communicate it, but I mean, for all that you are known for being an actor and a Shakespeare communicator, you're a very good writer on Shakespeare. And I mentioned a couple of your books in the introduction. What are you working on? And I hear tell that you're working on a new book. And what are you allowed to tell us about it?
I am. It's pretty nearly finished. It's I started writing it a while ago, and I'll read the first page of it for you if you like.
Yes.
Which is ironic because it sets up the idea of, let's say, for example, you happen to be isolated and trapped on a desert island, and you decided you wanted to read Shakespeare. Where on earth do you start? So the irony of the situation right now is, well, perhaps I was just more prescient than I hoped, but it's nearly finished, and here's the opening of it. Where do you start when you want to read Shakespeare? Let's say that going to see him is inconvenient, impossible, or it's not practicable. The apocalypse has come, the zombie apocalypse, while you were shipwrecked with a case of fresh Shakespeare. You've got food and everything else, you're perfectly comfortable, but Shakespeare is all you've got to read. And while you were being shipwrecked, you were filled with an insatiable desire to read. How to approach this large body of work? Alphabetically? By genre? Chronologically? Reading the plays chronologically is admittedly not the obvious choice, nor, as it turns out, is it the simplest. Shakespeare was the David Bowie of the Elizabethan theatre world. He reinvented himself with every new piece of work and staggered a generation. This book will help someone feel comfortable reading Shakespeare, speaking a sonnet, going to see a production, or just talking with friends about his plays, poems, and sonnets. That's the opening page, and the working title at the moment is called Reading Shakespeare Chronologically, Close Encounters of the Bardic Kind.
Oh, fantastic. That's a lovely line. Shakespeare was the David Bowie of the Elizabethan era. I like that.
You should see the cover.
Tell me, describe it.
It was actually gifted to me by the head of a wonderful school, the Limpfield Grange School for girls that educates younglings with learning difficulties. Sarah Wilde, and is the head there. And she said you should paint the Ziggy Stardust flash across Shakespeare's face. So I like that very much as the cover.
That's amazing. I can't wait for this to be out. Who's publishing?
Good question. That's
Who's
not
your agent.
It is about to be put out.
Hey, now listen, I know we have lots and lots of publishers watching this. This is a steal, surely. David Bowie of the Elizabethan era, Shakespeare, Ben Crystal. Come on, one of you. Get hold of it. How can people get hold of you, Ben? On your website, I assume?
Absolutely, website, Twitter. By all means, reach out to my very, very wonderful and amazing agent, Catherine Summerhayes, or direct to me. Or
you're with Catherine Summerhayes at Curtis Brown?
Curtis Brown, yeah.
Good agent, fantastic. Please pick up this strand. A sensible, lovely publisher out there. This is a Shakespeare for our ages. Come on a desert island. I was thinking of John Donne the other day. No man is an island entire of itself. Each man is a piece of the continent, a part of the main. And I'm thinking, not so much at the minute, really. Although, of course, I mean, I'm in Warwickshire where there's a much stronger sense of community than I would hitherto have imagined. Can we talk a little bit about your own acting career? Because I know that you have performed not only Shakespeare and other stuff around the world, from arts festivals and theatres in the States. And I'm very interested by what you were doing in Japan. Can you talk us a little bit about that? That sounds like one hell of a cultural experience.
Sure, it really, really was. I feel very, very grateful and very blessed for the honour and the opportunity. I first went to Japan in 1984 on one of the lecture tours of my father. I was 7. I have memories of sunburn and Disney and arcade machines and neon lights everywhere. But a love of the country stayed with me. And I went back there for a lecture tour in 2017 and then again in 2018. And over the time there, learned so much about the culture, learned so much about kabuki theatre, made some wonderful contacts in some beautiful small communities, and discovered a great love for the shokunin, the Japanese word for craftsman. Yeah. And a lot of the work for this book was to see to see the 20 years that Shakespeare writes through from the first person perspective of this craftsman and his team of craftsfolk who created these wonderful works week on week, year on year. There is so much craft in Shakespeare, and there's so much craft in Kabuki. Now, Kabuki theatre has been pretty much unchanged for the last 400 years. They're still all male companies. They are still raising their shows in 2 or 3 days. And they're creating really quite extraordinary pieces of art in that short space of time. And the understanding is that Shakespeare's company worked in a very, very similar way. Now, Shakespeare production has, of course, changed an awful lot, and thank goodness it's now multi-gendered. It's now, you know, casting blind. Anyone of any age, background can play any part, and thank goodness. We've been exploring that kind of company dynamic. I've pull actors from all over the world, of all ages and sizes, shapes and creeds, and but we raise our shows very, very quickly. We've been making shows using modern adaptations of original practices. Like, for example, Shakespeare's actors would never have had a whole copy of the play. They would write out their parts and write out their cues, and they wouldn't have anything else anyone would say. That focuses your attention on your lines very, very clearly and carefully, and it somehow lets you learn it more quickly, and it allows us to put the play together more quickly. And there are a bunch of other techniques that we've developed too. We've been making our shows in 5 days. We did a couple of shows in 3 days. And I wanted to ramp the experiment up, and it seemed fitting to do it in a place that was appreciative of this kind of craft exploration. So we got to Japan in late September. We had a couple of days recovery on the ground because people were coming from all different time zones. We started to build the ensemble in a World Heritage Site in Nikko. Then we traveled up to the mountains in Nagano onto a stage, a shrine stage at the top of a very small town called Besho Onsen. I'd fallen in love with the community there. We were the first company to ever perform English theatre and Shakespeare on that stage. It's a 600-year-old stage, I think. It was beautiful looking out over the town. And we made Macbeth for them and performed it in original pronunciation in 3 days.
Wow.
The audience from the town came up to us afterwards, and every single one of them said, "We did not understand 99% of what you said." But they said, "We followed the story perfectly."
Yeah.
One person said, "Communication of heart is your craft."
What a fantastic quote. Communication of heart is your craft.
And then we tripped down to Tokyo and we raised Romeo and Juliet in 2 days. Then we performed it in a very, very small mountain community on the island of Shikoku, the South Island, near a town called Kochi. And then we went back to Tokyo, raised Hamlet in, I think, the amount of rehearsal time on the stage was very original practices. It was, we rehearsed the dances and the fights in 90 minutes, and then we improvised everything. So we're getting closer and closer and closer to the kind of speed that Shakespeare's company was supposed to have, making 6 shows in a week. And I'm working with the Shakespeare North Playhouse in Knowsley, just north of Liverpool, that is currently coming out of the ground as we speak now. They're building a new original practice Shakespeare Playhouse. And with all luck, if all goes well, we'll be there with them exploring this and ramping the experiment up even further for a year or so when it opens in 2022.
Fantastic. Well, what a hell of a story. That, I mean, goodness me, that's impressive. Just as an aside, I love the idea that you performed on a stage that is older than Shakespeare himself, a 600-year-old stage in Japan, before even he was born. 150 years before he was born. That's extraordinary. I once did a thing in Kerala some years ago. I befriended a Kathakali band, or troupe, I suppose you call them. So arguably one of the oldest theatrical disciplines and performances in the whole world. And I'd taken a copy of Midsummer Night's Dream out with me just to read on the plane. And we ended up this conversation, and I ended up reciting some edited scenes from Midsummer Night's Dream, and they improvised a sort of modern Kathakali. This was such traditional Kathakali artist who ground his own paint as part of the preparation for the performance from minerals with oil to make himself up. It was the most extraordinary experience.
All of the linking and the hand gestures and stuff. I've seen a Carolean Cat Carley company at the Globe. There's a woman called Annette Lede.
Yes.
They're extraordinary.
It is an extraordinary experience. We are sadly running out of time, but Ben, you did very kindly promise me 3 sonnets. Can I hold you to your promise?
I did.
Thank you very much.
Gladly. I recorded this sonnet on Twitter at the beginning of all of this lockdown-ish stuff, and it seemed to be it read to me as a moment of hope, I suppose, and people seem to receive it that way. So I hope it gives folk out there a little hope from Shakespeare. This is Sonnet 56. Sweet love, renew thy force. Be it not said thy edge should blunter be than appetite, which but today by feeling is allayed, tomorrow sharpened in his former might. So, love, be thou, although today thou fill thy hungry eyes, e'en till they wink with fullness, tomorrow see again, and do not kill the spirit of love with a perpetual dullness. Let this sad interim, like the ocean be, which parts the shore where 2 contracted new come daily to the banks, that when they see return of love, more blessed may be the view. As call it winter, which being full of care, makes summer's welcome, thrice more wished, more rare.
That's just beautiful, Ben. Ben Crystal, reading sonnet number?
That's 56.
Sonnet number 56.
I love
Ben,
I think of this as like an interim. Call this winter, which being full of care makes summer's welcome, thrice more wished for, more rare. I don't know how he does it. I genuinely don't know how he does it, and I'm in awe of how he does it.
There are lots of people that don't know how he did it or does it.
I'm glad to keep trying to find out, though.
What's the first thing you're going to do when lockdown is over?
Give you a call.
We shall go and have a drink, and you can bring your lovely dog Edie, and we'll go for a walk in a park and have a picnic. I think that'll be a very, very fine idea.
I think, like everyone else, some sort of togetherness, some hugs, and some celebration.
That would be good, wouldn't it? Speaking of hugs, would you please give your wonderful parents, Dr. David, Crystal, a big hug from me, and your mum, whose name I've just instantly forgotten.
Hilary.
Hilary, of course, and Hilary. Please send them my very best wishes. And please, on behalf of the whole of Lockdown Festival, and please, on behalf of the entirety of Lockdown LitFest, Ben Crystal, thank you so much for celebrating the anniversary of Shakespeare's 456th birthday with us. Ladies and gentlemen, it's been such a pleasure to have Ben. I hope you've enjoyed hearing him talk about Shakespeare in the original pronunciation and with original practices. If you're at all interested in any of his works, can I point you to his website, which is www.bencrystal.com.
That's the one.
That's the one. And you will find below this screen a buy the book button, which in this case is going to be for his excellent and illustrated dictionary of Shakespeare, which is published with the OUP and which was shortlisted for the 2016 Educational Writer of the Year Award. It's an incredible work, and to be honest, quite a lot of what I know about Shakespeare I've had to backfill by reading his book. So do find that at the bottom here. Ben Crystal, thank you so much indeed. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for coming to join us here at Lockdown LitFest. And as ever, we hope you're keeping safe, we hope you're keeping well, and we hope you're looking after the people that you love. Cheerio from all of us.